They called it the frontier, a place where the law was thin as paper and a man's life could end before his coffee got cold. The Wild West was violent by nature, brutal by necessity, and armed to the teeth in ways that most history books refuse to talk about. But here's what the textbooks leave out. Not every weapon that showed up on the frontier was tolerated. Not every gun, blade, or instrument of destruction was welcomed at the saloon door or the cattle trail. Some weapons were so savage, so indiscriminate, and so catastrophically effective at ending human life that even the lawless frontier drew a line. Towns that couldn't agree on what day it was somehow agreed that certain weapons had no place among civilized men. And the irony is rich because these were men who shot each other over card games, rustled cattle across state lines, and hanged a man on nothing more than suspicion. These were not gentle people setting moral boundaries, but even they had limits. The 8 weapons you are about to hear were banned, restricted, confiscated, or outright outlawed in frontier towns, military camps, saloons, and cattle drives across the American West between roughly 1860 and 1900. Some were banned by city ordinance. Some were banned by military order. Some were banned because a single incident made an entire community decide that enough was enough. Every single one of them has a story soaked in blood. This is the history they cleaned up before putting it in the museums. These are the 8 Wild West weapons so brutal they were banned on the frontier. Number 1. The LeMat revolver. The gun that fired 9 shots and a shotgun blast. Most revolvers of the Civil War era fired 6 shots. The LeMat fired 9, and then, when those 9 were gone, it fired something far worse. The LeMat revolver was designed by a New Orleans physician named Jean-Alexandre Lemasse somewhere around 1856. He was a French-born Creole doctor who apparently decided that medicine was not sufficiently violent and pivoted to firearms design. The result was one of the most intimidating handguns ever carried into the American West. The LeMat had a standard revolver cylinder holding 9 rounds of .42 caliber. Most frontier gunfighters were walking around with 5 or 6 shots before they had to reload. The LeMat gave you 9. But that was not the part that made men pale when they saw it. Running through the center of the cylinder, acting as the cylinder pin, was a second barrel, a smoothbore barrel, a shotgun barrel loaded with buckshot or a single heavy ball, 1 revolver, 9 rifle caliber shots, 1 shotgun blast, 10 chances to end a fight before you touched your powder horn. The LeMat became closely associated with Confederate officers during the Civil War. Generals P.G.T. Beauregard and J.E.B. Stuart both reportedly carried LeMats. The Confederacy ordered thousands of them, manufactured in France and England because the South lacked the industrial capacity domestically. Getting those guns through the Union naval blockade was its own adventure. After the war ended, surplus LeMats trickled into the frontier West. Soldiers who had carried them home, traders who acquired them from military surpluses, gunsmiths who bought them cheap. The LeMat found a second life in the saloons and trail towns of the American West. And that shotgun barrel is exactly why towns started refusing to let men carry them. A standard revolver, even in the hands of a drunk and furious cowboy, had limitations. The shooter had to aim. He had to line up his target. Even the most notorious gunfighters of the era missed more than they hit at distances beyond 15 feet. The revolver required a degree of deliberate targeting that gave innocent bystanders at least a fighting chance. The LeMat's shotgun barrel required none of that. At close range, which is what a saloon fight always was, a blast from the LeMat's smoothbore barrel did not ask the shooter to aim. It spread. It covered a cone of destruction that could take out the man in front of you, the man to his left, the man pouring whiskey behind the bar, and the mirror on the wall. The LeMat turned every close-quarters confrontation into something closer to an artillery strike than a gunfight. Abilene, Kansas, under Marshal Wild Bill Hickok in 1871, was among the first frontier towns to specifically prohibit weapons capable of multiple fire modes or a shotgun-style spread within city limits. The wording was loose and enforcement inconsistent, but the intent was clear. You could carry a revolver because it required you to aim at a person. You could not carry something that turned a bar fight into a massacre. The LeMat did not disappear from the frontier. It went underground, carried beneath dusters and saddle blankets by men who knew better than to flash it in the wrong town. Confederate veterans who had carried them through 4 years of war were not about to surrender them because a Cattletown marshal posted a sign. But its reputation preceded it. In the oral history of the frontier, the LeMat occupies a particular category of dread. It was not just a gun, it was a statement of intent. A man who carried a LeMat was not preparing for a duel, he was preparing for a fight he expected to survive at any cost. Number 2. The Bowie knife with a knuckle guard, the weapon that made fistfights into butchery. The Bowie knife itself was not banned. Let that be clear from the start, because the distinction matters enormously. Jim Bowie's famous long-bladed knife, or rather the family of knives that took his name after his death at the Alamo in 1836, was a standard piece of frontier equipment. Men carried them for skinning game, cutting rope, slicing meat at the campfire, and yes, for fighting. Bowie knives were tools first and weapons second, and the frontier had no quarrel with a working tool. The weapon that got banned was a specific modification of the Bowie. A Bowie knife fitted with a brass or iron knuckle guard across the handle, sometimes combined with a weighted pommel or a second short blade on the reverse of the guard. These hybrid weapons went by various names in different regions. Knuckle knives, combination daggers, D-guard Bowies. The D-guard Bowie, named for the D-shaped iron guard that protected the hand and served as brass knuckles simultaneously, was widespread in the Confederate South and spread westward after the war. It was a weapon designed for a very specific type of violence, the kind where you got close enough to smell the other man's fear, and then you did not stop until one of you could not stand up anymore. With a standard Bowie knife, a knife fight had a certain terrible logic. Both men circled, both men cut. The more skilled or more lucky fighter survived. It was horrific, but it followed rules that human beings fighting with edged weapons had followed for centuries. The D-guard Bowie changed the calculation. The knuckle protection meant that the wielder could punch and stab in the same motion. The weighted pommel meant he could club and reverse and stab again. A man fighting a D-guard Bowie with a standard knife was facing a weapon that had no defensive gap. Every angle of attack was covered. Every motion was a potential killing strike. The results on the frontier were documented in the kind of graphic terms that local newspapers of the era reported, with a mixture of horror and barely concealed fascination. In 1868, the Cheyenne Daily Leader described the aftermath of a fight involving what the reporter called a combination knife as a scene more resembling a slaughterhouse than anything human conflict should produce. Texas was among the most aggressive jurisdictions in restricting these weapons. Texas had a long and complicated relationship with the Bowie knife in general, born partly from the Alamo mythology that surrounded Jim Bowie's memory. The plain Bowie was practically a state symbol, but several Texas municipalities passed ordinances in the late 1860s and 1870s that specifically prohibited carrying knives with handguards, combination weapons, or blades exceeding a specified length when combined with any kind of grip weapon. The reasoning was not complicated. A Bowie knife fight could kill you. A D-guard Bowie fight would certainly kill you, and it would do it in a way that left evidence requiring explanations that no town wanted to give. The men who carried them anyway were not subtle about what they were carrying or why. The D-guard Bowie was not a defensive weapon. Nobody carried one because they were worried about being attacked. You carried a D-guard Bowie because you were planning to attack, and you intended to be thorough. Number 3. The volcanic pistol with extended magazine. The frontier's first attempt at a machine pistol. In 1855, Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson sold their interest in a repeating arms venture to investors including Oliver Winchester. The company they left behind became the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company. The gun it produced was called the Volcanic Pistol. The Volcanic was genuinely revolutionary in concept. It was a lever-action repeating pistol that used a self-contained projectile called the rocket ball. The rocket ball was a hollow-base bullet with the propellant charge packed inside it, eliminating the need for a separate percussion cap or powder charge. You loaded the tube magazine under the barrel with rocket balls and fired them in rapid succession using the lever. The standard Volcanic held 6 to 8 rounds depending on the model. Extended magazine versions modified in the field by gunsmiths could hold 14 or more rocket balls. Here's the problem the frontier discovered almost immediately. The rocket ball propellant was underpowered. The bullets were slow and could not reliably penetrate heavy clothing at range. At 15 feet in a saloon, sure, it would ruin your evening. At 30 feet, a man in a heavy wool coat might absorb a volcanic round and respond unfavorably. But at point-blank range, the extended magazine variants alarmed saloon keepers and town marshals, not because of what they could do in a duel, but because of what they could do to a crowd. A man with an extended magazine volcanic who lost his temper could pull the lever as fast as his hand could move and put 14 rounds into the room in under 10 seconds. The accuracy would be terrible. The damage to bystanders would not be. Several frontier municipalities included magazine-repeating pistols in their weapons prohibition ordinances. Language clearly aimed at the volcanic and its imitators, the intent was consistent across jurisdictions. Weapons that could fire continuously without pause for reloading created a category of threat that single-shot and standard revolver weapons did not. The Volcanic Pistol Company was reorganized by Winchester in 1857, eventually becoming the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. But the Volcanic's legal legacy outlasted the company itself. The frontier's attempts to regulate magazine-repeating pistols represent some of the earliest gun control legislation in American history, born not of political philosophy but of practical experience watching men empty magazines into crowds. Number 4. The Apache Revolver, the most vicious street weapon ever made. The Apache Revolver sounds like something from a nightmare fever dream, and when you understand what it actually was, you will not disagree. It was a combination weapon. A revolver, a folding knife, and a set of brass knuckles, all integrated into a single compact device small enough to hide in a coat pocket. The cylinder held 5 or 6 rounds, the blade folded out from beneath the barrel, and the grip itself, formed from the knuckle duster frame, served as brass knuckles when the weapon was reversed and used as a club. The Apache was a European invention named after the Parisian street gang called les Apaches, who terrorized the underworld of late 19th century Paris. French criminals had a particular fondness for multifunction concealed weapons, and the Apache became the signature piece of their urban violence. It migrated to America through the port cities and eventually made its way west through the network of gamblers, criminals, and confidence men who followed the cattle drives and mining booms across the frontier. In the frontier context, the Apache revolver represented something specific and alarming. Every other weapon on this list was a weapon built for use at a distance. Even the D-Guard Bowie was a weapon you expected the other man to see coming. The Apache was designed entirely around violence that the victim never anticipated. The combination of functions meant that a fight with an Apache never went through predictable stages. A man attacked might be shot at close range, then stabbed as he fell, then struck with the knuckles as he tried to rise. Each motion flowed into the next. There was no pause to reload or to switch weapons. The Apache user moved through the phases of violence the way a skilled carpenter moved through the phases of a job. Efficiently, without hesitation. The concealment factor compounded the problem. A man wearing a Colt on his hip was announcing his capacity for violence. He was visible. That visibility carried its own deterrent effect. Nobody started a fight with an openly armed man without careful consideration. The Apache changed that calculation entirely. The man wearing an Apache in his vest pocket looked unarmed until the precise moment he was not. Several frontier towns banned concealed weapons as a category, and the Apache fell squarely into these prohibitions. Dodge City's famous ordinances against carrying firearms within city limits, enforced by Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, were explicitly concerned with concealed weapons. A man who carried openly was playing by the rules of the frontier. A man who concealed his weapon was playing by different rules. Its legacy is mostly found in confiscation records from frontier law enforcement. Documents from jails in Dodge City, Tombstone, and Denver show a steady stream of Apaches taken from gamblers, brothel workers, and traveling confidence men. These were not cowboys or ranchers. They were men who moved through the margins of frontier society and had decided that being underestimated was a survival strategy. Number 5. The punt gun. The weapon that could kill 50 birds with one shot, and men too. The punt gun is not a handgun. It is not a rifle. It is not anything that a reasonable person would describe as a personal firearm. A punt gun was essentially a cannon barrel mounted on a small flat-bottom boat called a punt. The barrel could be 4 to 8 feet long. The bore could be 2 inches in diameter. A single charge could weigh a pound or more of lead shot. Fired at a flock of ducks resting on water, a single blast could kill or injure 50 to 100 birds at once. They were built and used by commercial wildfowl hunters along American coastal waterways and river deltas from roughly the 1840s through the early 1900s. A professional punt gunner could harvest hundreds of birds in a single outing, supplying the restaurant trade in eastern cities with wild duck, goose, plover, and curlew. The punt gun appears on this list because of what happened when they moved inland and west. Market hunters who followed the buffalo herds onto the Great Plains adapted the punt gun concept, not always with the boat, but with the same principle of large bore, heavy charge weapons mounted on wagons or tripods to kill large numbers of animals simultaneously. The regulatory response was primarily economic rather than humanitarian. Kansas, Colorado, and several other plains territories passed early wildlife protection ordinances in the 1870s and 1880s that specifically banned market hunting methods, including oversized bore weapons used to take multiple animals in a single discharge. The birds and game were a resource. The punt gun was destroying that resource at an unsustainable rate, but the human element was not entirely absent. When competing hunting parties encountered each other on the open plains, the men who had punt guns mounted on wagons were not merely hunters. They were men with artillery. Several confrontations ended badly enough to contribute to a frontier consensus that weapons designed to kill large numbers of anything in a single discharge belonged in a different category from personal firearms. Number 6. The chain shot. Medieval murder on the American frontier. Chain shot is one of the oldest anti-personnel weapons in the history of artillery, and by any rational measure, it had no place whatsoever on the American frontier of the 1860s through 1890s. Chain shot in its classical form consisted of 2 iron balls connected by a length of chain fired from a cannon. The 2 balls flew apart and rotated in a flat, devastating arc. Originally designed to destroy the rigging of sailing ships, chain shot directed at human beings produced injuries that even experienced military surgeons found difficult to process. The Wild West had artillery. That fact is often omitted from popular imagination. The United States Army maintained significant artillery on the frontier for operations against Native American nations, and the surplus military hardware of the Civil War spread weapons of every conceivable type across the continent in the decades following 1865. Chain shot, or improvised versions of it, appeared in frontier conflicts in ways that left documentary evidence precisely because the results were so extreme that witnesses felt compelled to record them. Shotguns loaded with improvised chain or wire between 2 projectiles were documented in multiple frontier altercations, particularly in the mining regions of Colorado and Nevada, where disputes over claim ownership escalated to organized violence. The 1872 Eureka mining riots in Nevada involved accounts of improvised chain-loaded weapons being used between competing miner factions, leaving injuries that camp physicians described as incompatible with any standard firearms discharge. The investigation that followed contributed to Nevada territorial law, specifically prohibiting the modification of firearms with chain, wire, or multiple connected projectiles. The military also issued orders prohibiting chain or bar shot in frontier operations, not out of humanitarian concern but out of practical supply chain logic. Improvised ammunition damaged weapons. The prohibition was administrative, not moral, but it removed chain shot from the sanctioned arsenal even if it could not remove it from practice. What makes chain shot remarkable in this context is what it represents about human creativity in the application of violence. The frontier was not short of weapons. Chain shot appeared not because men lacked better options, but because some men, in some confrontations, decided that maximum damage and maximum psychological terror were exactly what they wanted. The banning of chain shot and its equivalents represents the community's recognition that some gradients of violence represent a departure from even the brutal norms of frontier conflict into something with no justification outside wartime necessity. Number 7. The Derringer shotgun hybrid. The bar gun that ended careers and lives. The single-shot Derringer was a frontier institution. Henry Derringer, a Philadelphia gunsmith, created the original in the 1850s, and the design spread so widely and was so widely imitated that the name became genericized into a common noun. A derringer, spelled with a double R to distinguish the copies from derringers originals, was any small pocket pistol designed for concealed carry at close range. They were carried by gamblers, prostitutes, saloon keepers, and anyone else who operated in environments where a visible weapon was impractical or socially unacceptable, but where protection was a constant concern. The derringer was the equalizer for people who could not afford to be seen as armed. Its single large caliber shot, typically .41 or .44 caliber, was devastating at the ranges where it would realistically be used, which was to say directly across a card table or through the partition of a stagecoach compartment. The Derringer shotgun hybrid took the Derringer concept and applied a different kind of logic to it. Rather than firing a single, large caliber bullet, these modified weapons fired a load of buckshot from a shortened shotgun barrel in a package small enough to fit in a vest pocket or beneath a bar counter. The legitimate commercial versions existed. The W.W. Marlin Company and several other manufacturers produced short-barreled percussion shotguns in pocket sizes during the mid-19th century, intending them as legitimate personal defense weapons for travelers and merchants. But the modification culture of the frontier, combined with the gunsmithing skills that were plentiful in any town with a blacksmith, produced countless improvised variants that pushed the concept well beyond what the manufacturers intended. The specific configuration that triggered the most aggressive regulatory response was the underbar weapon. Saloon keepers had a long tradition of keeping a sawed-off shotgun beneath the bar for protection against robbery. This was generally accepted by frontier law enforcement. The barkeeper's right to defend his establishment was not seriously contested. The underbar Derringer shotgun hybrid crossed a clear line. A full-sized shotgun beneath the bar was for genuine self-defense. A small, easily handled, short-barrel scatter weapon mounted on a swivel bracket was for something else. Several documented incidents in Colorado and Kansas mining towns in the 1870s involved saloon keepers using these weapons not to defend against robbery but to settle disputes and remove patrons in confrontations that had not yet escalated to violence. The weapon's design said something about intent that the frontier understood clearly. You built an underbar scattergun on a swivel mount because you anticipated firing it at a person already inside the bar, not at a robber coming through the door. The distinction between self-defense and premeditated violence was one that even frontier jurisprudence recognized. Several towns issued specific ordinances against concealed or mounted weapons behind commercial bars that went beyond standard revolvers. The language covered weapons designed to be concealed from view and capable of being fired without being raised to the shoulder, which described the Derringer shotgun hybrid precisely. Its legacy is largely invisible today because it was so effectively suppressed that it rarely appears in the historical record by name. Its effects appear in coroner's reports and newspaper accounts of saloon shootings, but the weapon itself was removed from polite frontier society so thoroughly that its story has mostly been forgotten. Number 8. The slingshot with loaded leather pouch, the assassin's tool of the frontier underworld. The final weapon on this list is not a firearm. It makes no sound. It leaves no gunpowder residue. It was used not in the dramatic public confrontations that defined the popular image of frontier violence, but in the dark alleys, back rooms, and private corners where the frontier's less celebrated violence took place. The slingshot in this context is not the Y-shaped toy of childhood imagination. The frontier slingshot was a leather pouch, sometimes weighted with lead or packed with buckshot, attached to a length of rawhide or leather cord. Swung with force, it delivered a concussive blow that could fracture a skull or collapse a windpipe. Thrown accurately, it could disable a target from a distance and in silence. The word slingshot was itself used inconsistently in the frontier era to describe several different weapons. In some documents, it referred to what would now be called a blackjack or a slungshot, a simple weighted leather weapon used as a club. In others, it referred to a genuine projectile sling of the ancient type. In still others, it described improvised weapons that combined elements of both. What they shared was the characteristic that made them specifically the subject of prohibition in ways that more obviously lethal weapons sometimes escaped. They were weapons of surprise. They were weapons of darkness. They were weapons used on men who did not see them coming, did not know they were under attack until the blow landed, and frequently did not survive to describe what had happened to them. The frequency with which frontier coroners' reports described deaths from head injuries attributed to falls, horse accidents, or unspecified causes that bore the physical hallmarks of blunt force cranial trauma suggest that these weapons were in more common use than the historical record directly acknowledges. A man found dead in an alley with a fractured skull could have fallen. He could have been kicked by a horse. He could have been struck with a loaded leather pouch by someone who knew exactly where to aim and how hard to swing, and who was gone before the body was cold. California was among the first jurisdictions in the American West to specifically ban what the statute called slungshots, weighted flexible weapons designed to be swung or thrown to deliver concussive force. The California statute dated to 1868 and was specific enough to distinguish slungshots from ordinary tools like leather pouches used in weighing or measuring. The intent was clear. If it was designed to hit a person and make them stop moving, it was a slungshot and it was prohibited. Other Western territories followed with similar statutes through the 1870s and 1880s. The Arizona Territory's weapons ordinances explicitly listed slungshots alongside Bowie knives with guards and brass knuckles as prohibited offensive weapons. The Colorado Territorial Legislature added them to weapons bans in 1872. The pattern was consistent enough to suggest that law enforcement officials across the frontier were encountering the same weapon in the same context, which was to say, dead men in circumstances that defied the official explanation. The particular brutality that put the loaded slingshot on this list is not its lethality per se. Plenty of the weapons on this list were more reliably lethal. It is the nature of the violence it represented. Every other weapon on this list, however terrible, was a weapon that required its user to commit openly to the act of violence. You drew a gun. You pulled a knife. You raised a scattergun from behind a bar. These were acts that announced themselves in the moment of their commission. The man with the loaded leather pouch in his coat pocket was carrying the intention of violence without carrying its announcement. He was the frontier's version of something that civilization has always feared more than the open killer. He was the man who smiled at you, bought your drink, walked out behind you into the night, and let the darkness do his explaining for him. The frontier banned these weapons not merely because they were dangerous, but because they represented a kind of moral cowardice that even a community of killers refused to tolerate. In a world where violence was practically a social institution, where disputes were settled with guns in the street, and where the man who drew fastest was not merely the survivor, but the winner in the court of frontier public opinion, the hidden weapon of the assassin was a transgression against the code. That code was brutal, inconsistent, often corrupt, and enforced by men who were sometimes worse than the outlaws they pursued. But it existed, and the weapons that violated it, the weapons that were too indiscriminate, too concealed, too calculating, too destructive of the thin tissue of order that held frontier communities together, those weapons got banned. Not because the frontier was civilized, because even the uncivilized have lines they will not cross. The 8 weapons you have just heard about were not banned because frontier communities were gentle or law-abiding. They were banned because even the most violent societies develop a working theory of what violence is acceptable and what violence is not. The Lamat revolver turned individual disputes into massacres. The D-Guard Bowie knife made close combat into butchery with no rules and no exit. The extended volcanic pistol put continuous fire into the hands of anyone angry enough to hold the lever down. The Apache revolver made covert assassination a standard item of criminal commerce. The punt gun and its land-based equivalents treated wildlife and occasionally people as indistinguishable targets for mass destruction. Chain shot and its improvised derivatives brought the logic of naval warfare to bar fights and mining camps. The underbar Derringer shotgun hybrid institutionalized the ambush as a business practice, and the loaded slingshot gave the quiet killer an instrument that left no witnesses and created no evidence. Every one of them found its way onto a prohibited list not through philosophical debate, but through the specific and documented experience of communities that had watched these weapons in use and decided, collectively, that the cost was too high. The frontier was not peaceful, it was not safe. The men who rode its trails and drank in its saloons were not operating under any illusion that they were going to die in bed at an advanced age. But they built towns. They established newspapers and courts and saloons with mirrors behind the bar that they could watch for trouble. And they wrote ordinances that said, in language as plain as the land itself, that some weapons had no place among people trying to make something last. That is the part of frontier history that the mythology forgets. The frontier did not just celebrate violence. It also tried, imperfectly and inconsistently and with more than a little hypocrisy, to control it. The weapons got banned. And the men who carried them anyway had to live in the knowledge that the community they moved through had looked at what they carried and decided what it meant about them. In a world with very few certainties, that was one. Stay curious. Stay armed with knowledge. And if you enjoyed this dive into the real history of the Wild West, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next one.